people will feel better and will be able to do more and have more success if you just give them the space and maybe just a couple words of encouragement. And you don't need to worry so much. Like, let people explore and experiment.
Hi, my name is Peter Knegt, and I am here with Sasha Velour, one of the most iconic winners of RuPaul's Drag Race ever, and the author of this soon-to-be very iconic book, The Big Reveal, an illustrated manifesto of drag. Thank you so much for being here. It's an honor.
Peter, thank you so much for having me. I'm excited to be here in this gorgeous, colorful, gay little room.
Yeah, it's my living room. So I've spent the past week reading this book, so it's a little surreal to have you here just because you've been in my head for a week. But I really loved it, and I learned so much from it. I feel like I'm pretty well versed in queer history, but like so much in there I had no idea. Oh. And at one point you say something along the lines of like, only when we have an understanding of our collective past can we sort of move forward. And I want to thank you because I feel like a little bit closer to moving forward because I have a better understanding because of this book. So thanks.
Thank you. I'm so glad. Thank you for being someone who knows about the past. And it was my goal to be able to have a couple new reveals in there for people who do know everything. There were things I discovered I never knew before.
So first off, I'm just curious what your process was. Like, it must have been a lot of work, obviously, but also must have been so much fun.
It was so much fun. I got like inspiration from learning about the types of drag that have existed before, and from kind of realizing that we can't invent anything new in drag or probably anywhere in the world. We can just bring more types of different people and get involved in it and have different threads all happening at the same time. So new combinations maybe. So I love learning what's existed before. And I discovered what I really needed was a book that had all the information in a clear way that went into detail, or at least as much detail as I can get into while covering everything. And since it didn't exist, or the forms that existed were so impartial, I wanted to tie it together more fully, more expansively. So I had to write it myself, and I put it together over about 3.5 years, and it took so much revision. I wanted it to be right.
What were some of your primary sources? Like, I know you said at one point that there just are very few.
Yeah, there's a lot of out-of-print books. Okay. So I got my hands on a couple, many which use really outdated language and have kind of, like, I feel, inaccurate distinctions between drag and cross-dressing, whatever that is, and trans expression, because it seems to me these things are more interconnected, or we realize the fluidity between different forms of queer expression every day. So there were a couple books. There's actually one that I bought at a thrift store in Toronto while visiting, called Dressing Up, that is super dated but has amazing resources I'd never heard about. So yeah, every thrift store, every like vintage bookstore I went into, I looked for drag things. And then there are a couple academic books. There's a great piece called The Changing Room by Lawrence Senelek, written in the early 2000s, that covers a lot of the similar stuff, but it's a little hard to decipher. So I spent a little time with that, trying to weed through what is talked about, combined with some radical trans history from figures like Susan Stryker more recently, and of course legends like Leslie Feinberg, who's one of my heroes, who was one of the first in the 90s to present a radical queer and trans history for the modern person.
And I mean, what I loved about it is you really write it in this very accessible way. Like, I really feel like, you know, if people feel sort of intimidated by the words queer theory, for example, they shouldn't be intimidated by this book. I feel like it's a really great, entertaining read where you sort of are surprised at how much you've learned in just like 10, 20 pages, because you do pack a lot in there, but it's not in a way that feels like homework.
Okay, good. I love that. I feel like I learned that in the drag bar, like figuring out how am I going to get some philosophy to a bunch of drunk people looking to like laugh and cheer and cry. And somehow that's like became the magic of the Sasha Velour voice that I developed at shows like Nightgowns. And the Brooklyn drag scene's really tolerant of that. So I had a good place to develop that style.
Absolutely. At one point you do make a prediction about the future of drag. You say that it'll be more inclusive, more celebrated, but then on the flip side, potentially more divisive, and that, you know, times are cyclical and etc. That felt sort of prophetic to me reading it, even though I know you wrote it probably a year ago and it came out today. What has happened in the past year is extremely troubling, to say the least. What do you make of what's going on? And your book is so hopeful. Like, also, what can we do to push forward as a community?
Gosh, I mean, I think we have no other choice, because we're not gonna not be ourselves. We're not going to let trans medical care be halted for young people who need it to live their lives. So we're gonna find a way. We've existed being illegal before, we can continue existing. One thing I'm feeling is that I think this backlash is less about the visibility of drag and more about everyone's comfort with drag and with trans people. Like, people overwhelmingly understand that this is normal, that this is fun, and I think that is what is so threatening. Less about what we're doing and more about people's acceptance of it. And I think that is not going to go anywhere. So this backlash is going to have a hard time truly convincing people who already know the truth to believe these lies.
I didn't know how many times sort of drag was mainstream, underground, that this keeps happening again and again. And I think it's important for us, as we do face what's going on now, to know that that's been the case. Something very positive that also you wrote before sort of something happened was you write about Sasha Colby in the book a couple times. At one point, I believe, calling her Miss Continental Performance one of the most sort of incredible things you've ever seen.
Absolutely.
She has now won Drag Race. Just tell me a little bit about how great that must have been for you to watch that season and watch her sort of triumph in such an iconic and huge way.
It was so exciting. She is a drag queen's drag queen, as she herself says, because we keep telling her how much we love her. Her ability to perform on stage, and then her warmth and sense of building community in the dressing room, off stage, with the audience is truly inspiring. And she was someone I fell in love with completely outside of Drag Race, and to me represented the kind of amazing artist that Drag Race hadn't figured out how to bring into their platform. So the fact that that has shifted, that this big platform for drag has figured out how to celebrate someone as brilliant as Sasha Colby, shows, kind of like I said, that drag is growing more inclusive, that these mainstream platforms are seeing more of the full picture of drag.
And you do tell a story about Sasha Colby talking to a psychic and then calling. I mean, I don't want to ruin anything from the book, but there's literally 1,000 things that I won't ruin from the book. Do you want to talk a little bit about that?
Yeah, she was meeting with a psychic, I think about her own family. We're all bonded through various family traumas and loss, but I guess the psychic had a message for me from my mom. That's what she told me. And I joked with her and in the book that it was very like my mom to call my friends if I hadn't checked in with her in a while. So it just seemed like another extension of that from the great beyond. So I don't really know. I don't know if I believe in psychics, but it was a moment that brought us closer, and we talked about both having lost a parent and mental health and grieving and putting on a happy face and beautiful lipstick and dancing and twirling for people, even in the midst of kind of personal struggles. And it's a reminder that what we build isn't just art and entertainment. It's also these connections with each other that go so deep and that help us survive and cope.
Yeah, I mean, I don't know if I believe in psychics either, but I do believe in sort of spirits being brought forward through art. And this book really does do such a beautiful sort of tribute to not just your mother, but your grandmas, Dina and Joe. I just, like, anytime they popped up in the narrative, I was like, oh, they just seem like truly like the most wonderful possible people.
I'm so glad. I feel like, yeah, as drag queens, we are channeling these women in our lives who made such an impact and made us excited about or see the feminine connection in myself, certainly as a little gay boy, and now as a fabulous gender fluid drag queen. So I wanted to pay tribute to them and celebrate all the different kinds of femininity I was exposed to as a kid and how that shaped my sense of it now for myself.
One thing that I really loved about this book was that it really sort of lays to rest what I think are the two greatest sort of misconceptions in queer history or queer cultural history. One is Stonewall, which I think you very eloquently and thoughtfully sort of like talk about the mythology around, but also, you know, really sort of get into in an interesting way, but also camp. Are you sick of explaining what camp means to people?
I feel like every time I explain it, I confuse myself more, which I ended up realizing is kind of the whole thing. But I really have fun taking apart because people use that term so loosely and so like offhandedly just to mean something kind of over the top or something kind of in bad taste or something kind of messy. And I think it is all those things, but it's also this fabulous opportunity for queer people to contextualize the way that culture treats us, which is not always wonderful, and claim that it is high fashion and high art against all odds.
I mean, I highly recommend anybody who wants to know how to explain what camp is to read your book.
Oh.
And also knows how to explain what's actually happened at Stonewall, which I really found fascinating. I knew, that there's been a lot of false truths about what happened that day, and sort of some of the pictures weren't really that day, and
Right.
that Sylvia and Marcia, were not actually there potentially. But also, like, you named a bunch of names that I didn't know, like Zazu Nova and Jackie Hormona.
Yes.
And just names that people who were there that aren't part of the legend of
Right.
Stonewall. I think it's really important that people sort of understand that. So I just want to thank you for, really laying it out in a way where I'm like, oh, okay, that's what happened.
I mean, Stonewall became this, it's really synonymous with pride worldwide.
Yeah.
And yet we don't know really what happened, and there's no photos of it. So I think it's our job to like tell this story, especially because it is such a political one.
Yeah.
Not only about standing up specifically for queer and trans people and how they are being treated as a whole community, standing up for queer and trans people, but also like making sure that we're honoring the truth in our mythologies, in our representations in media, in our celebrations of the community, that we're staying true to the whole community.
And I mean, a running through theme in your book is that, we need to understand our truths to move forward. And you say specifically with regard to Stonewall that like a lot of the stuff that happened then is still happening now. And a lot of the people we forgot then, or that we didn't include then, or the real people who were, it's the police brutality then, it's all still happening now. And I think that's really a huge reason why people should understand what really did happen.
Right. Yeah, these dynamics, the notion that our queer spaces may not be the best at like capturing and supporting the whole community, and that what they really attacked that night, in addition to the police arresting them, was the bar that had been so unfriendly to trans people, to drag queens.
Another thing I was curious about, you talked about the word queer and how you define yourself as it, and when you sort of discovered that word, it really sort of opened things up for you. But there is like a bit of a pushback against that word now, which I find really challenging. Specifically, I think it's coming from older cis gay men. What do you think about that? And like, what are your thoughts on people who are like gay, not queer, or whatever this sort of movement is?
Oh, I have nothing nice to say about them. So I think, I mean, from the very beginning, like, this isn't a new term. In the 80s and 90s, it was reclaimed to be an activist term to encompass the whole community, to stand up against discrimination for trans people and to see us as an entire community. So what they're saying by not wanting to be called queer is they don't want to be seen as part of the same community as trans people. Yeah. They don't even really want to be seen as being part of the same community as women. And that's not a part of them. They shouldn't be a part of my community. I've been saying it at nightgowns at my bar show, like, oh, you're not even really gay. You just like have gay sex, and probably not very well. Because it takes a queer person who understands all the beautiful thing this community advocates for, freedom for all people, a new version of society that would have equality and opportunity for many different kinds of people, the full inclusive intersectional nature of the LGBTQ plus community. That's what makes us so strong and beautiful. And if you're missing out on that, like, you don't understand glamour, darling.
I had to learn this, I felt the hard way. I think a lot of queer people do, where some of the antagonists of the queer community are, technically queer themselves. Yeah. And that is a really unfortunate thing. A lot of TERFs, for example, are lesbians. It's the worst.
Yeah.
I'm wondering what the challenges were of documenting something that's so undocumented, a community that's gone so undocumented for many sort of reasons, mostly problematic. But why did you want to take that on? It's such a huge responsibility.
Yeah. I mean, I think that's why it's so important. Some of these stories have existed only in oral history, passed down backstage at a drag show or shared on a microphone. I think drag queens have been the keepers of this history. And so I've learned so much by talking to people, especially like many older drag queens all have lots of stories about the queer past. So I wanted to capture some of those. And then I think it takes a little imagination too. Like sometimes you read a story about a successful drag performer, female impersonator from the past. And I kind of read between the lines that they had a queer life that wasn't told. Maybe on the surface there were certain gestures that suggested, oh, this isn't a normal straight person outside of performance. But then there are little hints, little things that they wrote or photos of them with a close associate. And those, we have to use our imagination and context and knowledge of what it's like to be queer in the world to find ourselves in that history. And then I thought, I'm going to write us back into that. And I'm not going to just blow it up and take it completely out of context to say, okay, this person presented in one way, but their life was full of these little hints. And we can read between the lines. And there's, we've got to read between the lines, and it's kind of fun to do it.
So you're touring with this book right now all across North America. Do you want to talk a little bit what that tour looks like? It's not, I'm sure you're not going up and just reading from the book.
Oh, no, not at all. I do have a couple readings, but they have multimedia elements to them. I get to share some of the stories in the book. I get to illustrate with photos that I didn't share in here, and with some archival video from my own childhood, for example, that I think really adds a lot of color and shows just how queer little kids can be. And then there's a lot of performances. It's called The Big Reveal, so I needed to do some reveal acts, and I tried to do something even more show-stopping and exciting than the famous, rose petals that I'm known for, because I have a lot of ideas under this wig, so to speak.
And your book really makes clear those connections through sort of you going through all this history and showing so much queerness from hundreds and hundreds of years back. And I think it's just such an important thing for queer people to be aware of and read and learn from and put forth into the world. So, well, that seems like a really appropriate way to end things off here today. Thank you so much for taking some time to be here with me today, Sasha.
Thank you so much, Peter. I had a great time talking to you. Everyone looks so serious in these photos. I was like, I'm not going to do that.